Chapter 23. By September 1996, NF leaders continued to play their deadly game of chess amongst themselves. Lines were drawn, sides were chosen, and loyalties were suspect. By this time, Castaneda was so frustrated with Big Smiley claiming to be the boss of all bosses that he began insisting that any and all authority assigned to Big Smiley be moved out of Big Smiley's backyard and into his own. At one point, he even attempted to do so without proper NF approval. Since Castaneda's problem with Big Smiley were shared by quite a few of other Familianos, many parts of the newly constructed inner council lent him a sympathetic ear. The discomfort in their alliance came to a head in a controversy remembered as the D-Facility dilemmas. In the course of the dispute, Castaneda was central in both pulling D-Facility apart and then attempting to patch it back together at what seemed to be the last possible moment. Initially, that meant dropping his role as the one trying to work something out with Big Smiley and becoming one of Big Smiley's leading adversaries. The precipitating event was when Big Smiley demanded to be the overall authority in D-Facility. Amongst the inner circle, Big Smiley's manpower was considered notoriously corrupt and was said to have included known renegades. Such terms meant little to Big Smiley, whose standard of judgment was based on whether Familianos were willing to put their life on the line and accept the offer to function under his authority. By October 1996, the Inner Council was clamoring for Big Smiley's expulsion. Castaneda quickly surfaced as one of Big Smiley's harshest critics. When making his case, he opened with a leader's response to the simple issue of proper authority. Although hardly an honorable leader himself, Castaneda had serious questions about how Big Smiley conducted himself in pursuit of his duties as a high-ranking NF leader. Many of Big Smiley's decisions, he claimed, were full of selfish motives, and his attempt to be the self-appointed boss of all bosses was reprehensible. Castaneda often repeated the story of how Big Smiley arrived in D-Facility claiming to be the godfather. The Familianos from Salinas loved it, Castaneda complained, but it had only made the situation in D-Facility much worse. In that particular situation, he alleged the Familianos in D-Facility had been deprived of responsible leadership. In telling the story, Castaneda always laughed out loud as the sheer craziness of such behavior. Then he launched a much more serious attack. There was, he noted, the question of treason and Big Smiley's motives. The prison political trait that emerged in Castaneda with this line of argument left a number of Familianos with bitter memories of the D-Facility dilemmas. He insisted that Big Smiley had unauthorized recruits and that he was prepared to name names. We've impeached other Familianos in the past, Castaneda pointed out on one occasion, and we will do it again. It would be a serious mistake to allow any Familiano to act as if he were a dictator. Everyone who did so was sooner or later betrayed. NF members like that have some type of hidden agenda and are interested only in their version of the Nuestra Familia. Castaneda's opposition responded that Castaneda was the one with a hidden agenda and held his argument up as a classic example of a power-hungry Familiano trying to force all those in D-Facility to accept his version of NF priorities. Castaneda in turn called them traitors and rallied that the Nuestra Familia could not tolerate a presence as corrupt as Big Smiley. Within the next few months, the beginning of a rift amongst NF leadership finally surfaced in Pelican Bay. Provoked by Big Smiley's maneuverings with Castaneda now claimed that Big Smiley had been telling all kinds of lies and trying to sabotage his standings with the rest of the mob. As Castaneda explained it, it wasn't just what Big Smiley was doing to him that mattered. The point was that such behavior was overwhelming evidence of Big Smiley's irresponsibility and radicalism. Compelled by that conclusion, Castaneda finally ceased all communication with Big Smiley, explaining that it was a personal decision, but he made no attempt to stop other NF members from communicating with him. He had, however, expected some of the older Familianos to follow his lead. That expectation was communicated in a rapid-fire series of letters. Gerald Cuete Rubalcaba, by now one of the NF's highest-ranking captains and the official RSD and a good friend of Castaneda's, got his letter early in the month. In it, Castaneda asked him point-blank to withdraw any support he may have had for Big Smiley. Rubalcaba's subsequent dilemma was immense. His devotion to his old pal Castaneda was still largely intact. Despite the confusion provoked by what was happening in D facility, there was no one to whom Rubalcaba felt more attached or obliged. On the other hand, the position of RSD was by then the most important thing in his life, transcending any personal considerations. Rubalcaba was committed to being unbiased about D facility's dilemmas ever since the OGB's announcement that he would be leading the investigation. Nevertheless, whatever choice Rubalcaba made after that would echo of betrayal, since several NF members would remember subsequent conversations with Rubalcaba in which he referred to being under a tremendous amount of pressure from Castaneda. If he was, the pressure was probably indirect. Certainly, Rubalcaba would have been told that the final decision was his alone and that he should do what he thought was right, despite what Castaneda did himself. Just as certain, Castaneda would have made no secret of his disappointment if Rubalcaba ignored his recommendation. Castaneda's hope was that he could count on Rubalcaba's backing now that he needed it. That theme of someone close to him being victimized must have unleashed a heavy load on Rubalcaba's guilt. It did not, however, lead him to agree. Saying he wouldn't play favorites with Castaneda was hard, but Cuete felt his dedication belonged to the mob, despite what was going on between Castaneda and Big Smiley. He thought both Big Smiley and Castaneda were wrong, and he told them so. Rubalcaba also believed that had Big Smiley not transferred to D facility at a moment of intense ambivalence and indecision, it was doubtful he and Castaneda would have had any problems at all. If two styles of thought were destined to disagree, they were those of Big Smiley and Castaneda. Big Smiley was a take charge kind of guy who expected quick decisions from leaders, who had the authority to speak for everyone else. Castaneda, as a Familiano, was long since wedded to participatory democracy in substance as well as in form. Everyone had equal voice, and decisions were made only after consensus had been reached. Charismatic oratory was enormously suspicious, and Big Smiley overflowed with it. Castaneda distrusted the FC arrangements, and Big Smiley saw himself as the champion of La Nuestra Familia's best interests. The difference that eventually split the NF into fragments was already a crack running through NF headquarters at Pelican Bay. Smiley was on one side of it and Castaneda was on the other. Smiley's manpower was much more organized and established, but 50% of D facility's field force owed its allegiance to Castaneda. Since policy is often defined by how it's enacted, Big Smiley's dominance in D facility only heightened Castaneda's suspicions of his true objectives. Big Smiley's suspicions of Castaneda were solidified when Castaneda asked Rubalcaba to back an aggressive stance against him. Cuete's answer was that although he felt Big Smiley was a hopeless cause and that he was the last person that would change, he wouldn't, however, choose sides. By that fall, Big Smiley perceived Castaneda as the enemy. The bloodletting on the streets was about to begin. Towards the end of 1996, Angel Chongo Alvarez, a Familiano from Salinas in Pelican Bay State Prison, got caught up, as did many others, in the ongoing internal chaos caused by Big Smiley and Castaneda. Alvarez was manipulated into siding with, assisting, and functioning under Big Smiley's authority. Sometime in late January 1997, not long after making his decision, Alvarez paroled and returned to his hometown. He eventually contacted Cesar Lobo Ramirez, who by that time had become the most powerful NF member in Monterey County. He's a fucking weenie, man. Once they established contact and arranged a secure line of communication, Ramirez let Alvarez know that he was the overall NF authority in charge and that he wanted Alvarez to function within his regiment. Alvarez, unaware that Big Smiley was under NF investigation, was willing to work with, assist, and or function under Ramirez. However, he stated he would first have to clear it with Big Smiley, which was an unexpected, uninformed, and somewhat disrespectful response that Ramirez wasn't too thrilled to hear. After this initial conversation, Ramirez, unbeknownst to Alvarez, felt he had been disrespected. He had taken Alvarez's response negatively and felt as if his authority was being questioned. He was tired of having his authority questioned and decided that Alvarez was nothing but a stumbling block that would only get in his way. Ramirez, who didn't want a repeat of the situation he had experienced with Smith, concluded that Alvarez was a liability, not an asset to the regiment. Since Alvarez was a well-known drug addict, his brother was a snitch, and everyone who functioned under Big Smiley was on freeze, outsider status, it was easy for Ramirez to manipulate others into turning against him and to put him on the list, the hit list. Ramirez, who allegedly still had a chip on his shoulder and who wanted to save face after being embarrassed by Smith, decided to flaunt his power by making Alvarez the example he had wanted to make out of Smith. I guess that's when Lobo pulled out his little Cub Scout knife and Chino pulled out that fucking bone crusher. On or about February 12, 1997, 1 month after being released from prison, Angel Chongo Alvarez was stabbed to death. His mutilated body was found in a car parked behind the Acosta Plaza apartments on Sanborn Street in Salinas. Although no arrests were made, the murder was allegedly linked to Ramirez, Big Smiley, and/or the internal confrontations occurring amongst NF leaders and the rank and file. It was alleged that, with blood on his hands, Ramirez knew he was in for the long haul. He was building a very powerful regimental stronghold and a name for himself, and he considered it wise to surround himself with killers. He knew where he wanted to go and what he wanted to do to get there, and he solemnly swore not to allow anyone or anything to get in his way. After Alvarez's murder, and with no witnesses, arrest, or evidence linking him to it, Ramirez truly began to make his move. Alvarez was the first in a long line of examples Ramirez allegedly decided to make. Some of the older homeboys silently disagreed with the majority of his decisions, but for the time being, Ramirez remained the overall NF authority in charge, with full power to implement his will and more. Ramirez explained to his right-hand man, Rico Smiley Garcia, Chente, and a few of the local norteños what had taken place, why he had made certain decisions, and what exactly needed to be done. He knew he wasn't one of the most liked NF members in Salinas, but he was intelligent enough to know that there was strength in numbers and that he needed dependable allies to be a successful leader. He sought to establish a better rapport with some of the more influential homeboys, both in and out of prison, and begun to build a small but loyal following. To further his goals, Ramirez built a regimental bank to finance his stronghold and acquired a well-stocked arsenal he knew he'd surely need to stay in power. He developed a sophisticated game plan he knew would be critical in manipulating others into shielding him from any outside interference. He was at the top of his game, right where he wanted to be, and ready to progress to the next level. As the undisputed leader in Salinas, he was more than prepared to eliminate future competitors. But with the NF controversy going on in Pelican Bay State Prison, he knew he'd eventually be faced with some very difficult choices and that some of his decisions would be more than questioned at a later date. When Salvador Littleman Castaneda, one of Castillo's favorite proteges, paroled from San Quentin State Prison on March 7, 1997, he was totally unaware of Ramirez's newfound bloodlust for power. He didn't know that his younger brother Pablo, who he had vouched for while in the Monterey County Jail, had been found guilty of treason, which put Little Man in danger of being held accountable for Pablo's actions. Targets are usually the last ones to know. Tell me about it. Although Pablo's no good status was common knowledge on the streets, Little Man didn't have a clue. He was the type that usually kept to himself. He didn't like to bother people. He hadn't kept in contact with any of the homeboys while he was incarcerated, not a wise decision considering all of the different power struggles taking place in and out of prison. Therefore, he was ignorant about what had been taking place on the streets of Salinas in his absence. The only thing that Little Man knew for sure was that he had always been a solid NF soldado and had put in a lot of work for the mob. If for no other reason, he felt his accomplishments and loyalty were enough to assure that Pablo would be given a pass on his behalf. Yeah, that's crazy thinking. He was well known, respected, liked, and had always taken care of NF business before his own. Michael Castillo had brought him to the NF, and Little Man assumed that neither he nor his family would ever have anything to worry about. However, the mob had no qualms about eating its young, and we all know what happens to people who assume. After being released from prison, it was alleged that Little Man was escorted to the nearest Greyhound bus station, where he bought a ticket and boarded a bus headed for Salinas. As was to be expected, he was more than ready to see his friends and family. He especially wanted to spend his first night home with his girlfriend, whom he had not seen outside of his dreams in over a year. Once the bus arrived in Salinas, it was alleged that he called a few of the homeboys in his old crew to let them know he was out. It was then said that one of the homeboys offered to give him a ride to his girlfriend's house, which Little Man accepted. Although it was an extra cold evening, Little Man went outside to wait for his ride, without a care in the world. All he could think about was his newfound freedom, being reunited with his girlfriend, and how glad he was that he had some cool-ass homeboys willing to give him a ride. He couldn't wait to walk through the front door of his house and sleep in his own bed, but he never made it home. On March 8, 1997, less than 24 hours after his release, Castaneda's body was found in an artichoke field on Espinosa Road near Castroville. He'd been shot in the face and the head. The fingers of each of his hands were posed in a 1 and a 4, 14 to show that he had been killed by Norteños. No arrests were made immediately.